Okay, so welcome to our session today with our presenter, Esther Jackson. Dr. Jackson, I guess I should preface that, is a project manager and instructional designer at Innovative Learning Group in the Detroit, Michigan area. Is that correct, Esther?
Yes, we're in Troy, and that is the Metro Detroit area.
Great. Esther is coming to us and has spent a lot of time and about more than 15 years working for the city of Detroit as a project manager, instructional designer, and various human resources and information technology projects. There's so much to say about Esther. What I think is important to us is you are a member of ATD. You are serving as a national advisor for chapters and also a member of your local Detroit chapter. And so I think
Yes.
we all resonate with the balance of that. Esther earned her doctorate education specializing in higher education and adult learning, a master's degree in instructional technology, and a bachelor's degree in education from Wayne State University in Detroit. Esther is going to talk to us today about whether the IQ or EQ or AQ, everybody knows what that is, whether they are enough anymore. And we're going to go through a conversation about those cues today, learning what's the importance of that in leadership and performance improvement, the development of a roadmap to improve your leadership EQ and AQ, so some personal development on our end, I believe, and some practice steps to overcome any barriers that we identify in ourselves today. Esther, I hope I did a good job introducing it, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mary. That was great. And I am so happy to be here to be presenting for Central Ohio ATD. Just an awesome opportunity. And I would like to reiterate what we have here in the chat for those who are interested in a minute or so to maybe consider an answer. There is an opening question. But in the process, I'm excited to have an opportunity to engage with ATD Detroit folks because ATD rocks if you did not know, but I'm sure you all can relate with your chapter. And what we're looking to do here is essentially get into a few things. And as we get started, what I would like to do is go ahead and start sharing my screen. And we want to make sure we're going okay there. And I will ask if you all are able to see things okay here. How are we doing on that end in terms of seeing the leading with the right cues opening slide?
Esther, we see your note slide as well.
Oh, okay. So let's see if we are switching this. Are we seeing things okay now?
Right.
It looks great.
Awesome, awesome. What I will be doing is, because of my bandwidth and some issues I have encountered previously, I don't want to rock the boat there. So I will have my video off. My apologies for that inconvenience. But as we go through, once we get to a certain point, I will reactivate the video, if that works for you all. For our goals with the session, we are looking to distinguish among IQ, EQ, and AQ, recognize the importance of the cues to leadership, discuss steps to overcome barriers to enhancing your EQ and AQ, finally develop a roadmap to improve your leadership EQ and AQ. We did open up with an initial question regarding a zombie apocalypse and asking if you could think of 3 folks that just have to be on your team for this zombie apocalypse. Just wondered who else was able to come up with some folks. Kurt already saw that he wanted to have those committed folks right there in his row, the faithful few. So Kurt had a team going on. Anyone else chime in with the team for us, Mary?
Let me see. Seema Patel says Russell, who is her second in command,
Okay.
Laura Croft, and Black Widow.
Okay, I am familiar.
I'm all about the
Laura
women.
Croft
I'm all
and
about the
Black
women
Widow.
and Russell.
Awesome stuff there.
Yes.
Anyone else? All right, well, thank you all for sharing in that. One thing I thought was really great in taking a look at that and using that particular question is it taps into segments of the content that we will be addressing. Let's go ahead and get into a deeper dive. Question on Q. I'm going to ask Mary if we could go ahead with the first poll question. With this question on Q, I am asking if you can consider.
So I'm having some technical difficulties. It's not letting me launch the polls that we practiced earlier today. It says I'm logged in from another device, which I am not. We might need to do this via chat. I apologize.
No problem. No problem at all. So everyone, the question is, which Q do you think is more important? IQ, EQ, or are they both equal? Which Q is more important? Now we are covering 3 Qs in the chat, but this question is just focused on IQ and EQ. So in the chat, if you could respond to this question, which Q is more important? You can simply type IQ, or you can type EQ, or you can just type an equal sign. One of those 3 options, if you could enter into the chat, that would be awesome. Any response?
I'm watching it for you. Lots of EQs, 2 equals.
Okay.
But we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 EQs. Waiting to hear from some other people. 3 equals.
Okay. Almost a balance out there with the results.
Yep, but nobody's voting for IQ solo.
Okay. Sounds like we almost have a segue with this course. Maybe I'll jump to the second half since it already sounds like we have an upper hand with it. Not a bad deal there. EQ is indeed the answer. And we're going to get into discussing why. Surprisingly, IQ is not one that is considered to be as important or as EQ or even more important. EQ is definitely the one that takes the lead here. We will talk about the surrounding reasons as well as talk about where AQ comes into the picture. So let's take a deeper dive into the Qs, beginning with a short story I'd like to share. I call this the fence story. It's the story of a boy, young boy around the age of 7 or 8, who had a tendency to lose his temper. He talked to his father about this problem, which was initiated by his father. And his father talked about him addressing this and trying to find a way to avoid doing that. So what his father suggested that he do was he took him outside. There was a fence. And he told him to work on your temper. What I'd like you to do is every time you lose your temper, I want you to take a nail and drive a nail into this fence. And then come back and talk to me. So this is what the boy proceeded to do. He took a few weeks. Each time he would lose his temper, he would take a nail, drive this nail into the fence. Well, he reached a day where he didn't lose his temper. He did not have to take any nails, put any nails in the fence. So excitedly, he went running to his father to let him know the situation. And his father said, "Okay, take me out to the fence. Let's take a look." They go out to the fence. He sees the nails there, and the boy is really happy about it. And his father tells him, "All right, now what I'd like you to do, I want you to remove those nails that are in the fence from each time you lost your temper." So the boy removed the nails. And he said, "Look at what's left behind." He said, "Those holes are holes you placed in people from those times you lashed out and losing your temper and the behavior that you demonstrated." So my goal there, it really brings out a few themes. One being recognizing the need to improve, another being the ability to improve, and then finally the know-how to improve and willingness. And so this was something that really focused, I thought, and tied into what we are looking to gather from our session today and working to be hole fillers rather than nail drivers. So what is it that you can do to look at areas where you can improve or even build upon areas that you already have as strong suits? My goal is that you would see something that you're able to build upon, if not even take steps to address, that you can improve your relationships as well as what you do in recognizing the cues in your leadership. Any comments or questions before we go on? All right, thanks so much. So what are the cues? IQ is the intelligence quotient. EQ, the emotional quotient. Finally, AQ, the adaptability quotient. And this is also sometimes recognized as the adversity quotient. We have a few individuals here that many feel exhibit the Q, so I thought it would be great to have some actual characters or individuals that we can recognize from our present or even history to bring it to light for each Q and along with our descriptions. I'd like you to take a few minutes to identify examples of each quotient based on what we think we know. I would like you to reflect on the best boss you have had. You may recall situations where you recognize how this boss interacted, you observe how they handled themselves in certain situations. You're very conscious about how they face difficult situations or even challenges. For IQ, we may not have many responses beyond thinking of someone who's pretty smart, someone who is a really good decision maker or problem solver. So I would like you to just focus on EQ as the emotional quotient, AQ, the adaptability quotient, and just on the surface, what you think you may know about these before we take our deep dive. What qualities of these best bosses that you can reflect on would you say stood out for you regarding EQ and AQ? And if you could place that in the chat. One for me, for example, when I worked for the city of Detroit, his name was Mr. Bridges. And something that really stood out for me was, despite the number of folks we had on staff, he really had this innate ability to really meet people where they were. So many different personalities, so many different skill sets and capabilities. He was really good when it came to personalizing things. So I would say his empathy was just awesome. So any characteristics you can think of, if you could add those to the chat regarding your best boss. We have any responses coming in?
We
Mary?
do. Empathy. EQ is thoughtful in their words. I added 3 for EQ. Kind of always calm, not sense of anxiety. coming
Okay.
from this leader, very thoughtful and always present. Others, let's hear some others. Really hears you and works where you are. That's a good
Okay.
one.
I like those.
Maintained cool. Empathy and ability to have an awareness of their own emotions and presence. Protection from upper leaders' interaction to allow you to focus on your work.
Oh my goodness, I really like that one. That one reminds me a lot about some things Simon Sinek shared in Leaders Eat Last.
Mm,
Really connects to if you have to put so much energy into keeping yourself protected inside the organization, then you
yep,
become more vulnerable to external forces. And that last person's comment really speaks to that. So
yep.
that was
That was Todd. I don't know if Todd wants to add anything. Yes, he said.
I mean, I don't know. I mean,
thanks for that, Todd.
I could just add, I had no idea that that was going on and she was protecting us from all that until like years later. And then,
Wow.
wow, all that was going on with her boss and she kept all that from us. And I thought that was a really good trait.
And you hit on a very pertinent point there, Todd. Thank you for sharing that. Because it seems like, you know, sometimes we don't have that immediate recognition of the impact of the benefit of the gain with a certain person's experience and how they have interacted with us, how we have benefited from that relationship until maybe sometime later down the road when we go through other experiences. And so that really connects with the point I wanted to drive and looking at our understanding of the cues. A lot of how we demonstrate our cues is based on what we recognize in other leaders, others who are in positions of authority, as well as our experiences. And those positions of authority could be within our upbringing as well as in the workplace. So it also is representative of guardianship, parents, and so on and the like. Another point I wanted to share is regarding how we view all the cues when we talk about leading with the right cues. One direct quote I'd like to share that I found just really strongly built into the ability and the willingness to lead with the right cues came from, again, Simon Sinek. And I promise you all I will reference some other items, but this one was really a passion for me. His Leaders Eat Last. He said, leadership is about taking responsibility for lives and not numbers. And given the current state of things, that is something that is really challenging for a lot of leaders right now. He also said, managers look after our numbers and our results, and leaders look after us. All managers of metrics have an opportunity to become leaders of people. And leading with the right cues is something that is going to assist you with that. All right, any final comments, questions before we move on?
Just one comment to please mute your lines if you've got background noise. Thank you.
Talk about how we define the cues. So again, we are recognizing IQ is the intelligence quotient. I believe we are still in need of you to mute your line.
You know what? I have an idea.
I'm going to see if I can just do that for us. Let me, we can press on.
We'll go buy another one. And then the next time you're here, you can take it down.
Okay.
Thanks, Mary. Awesome.
Mhm.
EQ, the emotional quotient. EQ is also recognized as emotional intelligence. I often see those used interchangeably. They are distinctly different, and I will get into that within the next couple of slides, but we will use them interchangeably. EQ being emotional quotient or emotional intelligence. And then finally, as I previously mentioned, AQ is the adaptability quotient, also known as the adversity quotient. IQ, we're simply talking about the ability to learn or understand. EQ is our ability to perceive, assess, and manage emotions of oneself and others. And someone really hit at the heart of this description in a comment that you provided concerning the best boss. And I do not recall which person that was, but someone had a really good description that really tied into the definition for EQ. And then AQ, the ability to face and overcome changes and adversities. What a reality hit with, our current crisis in the midst of what we are experiencing now. Historically, once IQ was recognized as the primary determinant of leadership performance, that's no longer the case. More Qs have come on the scene with relevance to leadership performance. So from these definitions, what we're looking to do, let's take a look at a timeline so we can see more about how and when they came onto the scene, or I'll say more so when they came onto the scene. So we were introduced to IQ by William Stern in 1912. Not until 1995 did we hear anything about this EQ or emotional quotient, which was introduced to us by Daniel Goleman, who is a researcher, author, someone who is recognized as an author, as someone who is a subject matter expert in the area of emotional intelligence. Paul Stoltz, 1997, just 2 years later, he introduces us to AQ. And when he introduced AQ, he introduced it as the adversity quotient. And then in 2004, less than 10 years later, we have XQ and PQ that come on the scene. Has anyone heard of those ever? Is anyone familiar with XQ or PQ? Anyone want to be unmuted and give us your thought on what XQ and or PQ may be? Or you're welcome to enter it into the chat as well. XQ or PQ. Anything coming in for us, Mary?
Nope. It's pretty quiet. Personality quotient, that's the only thing that comes to my mind about PQ.
Okay.
But
Thank you for sharing. And thank you all for even giving thought to that. So that was a serious brain teaser, I gather. And that's typically the case in most of the webinars where I present this particular presentation. I have only had, I believe, one person to get one of these. And I think close to 10 times I have done this presentation. According to Stephen R. Covey, in The 8th Habit, if you all are familiar with 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, a sequel to that was The 8th Habit, From Effectiveness to Greatness. XQ is where he introduced the metric for the execution quotient. This is the measure of how well people focus on and execute what he calls the WIGS. So if you are familiar with his focus presentation, and that's in that 7 Habits series there, he talks about WIGS, which are the wildly important goals. And then he identified PQ as physical or body intelligence. Although these cues are not a part of our focus in the session, I did want to mention them simply because we are seeing more cues come onto the scene. You may be familiar or hear about an SQ, which is a spiritual quotient by another researcher. And so these cues are just ways of tapping into a specific measure. So quotient, when you hear that attached to a particular area, a particular focus, is really just a way of assigning a measure or a type of metric that gets into a measure for one's ability in that given area. And that tends to be based on their aptitude with a certain type of standardized test or even some type of assessment. So that's just an overview of the Q's timeline. Just thought that would be helpful to have an understanding of how those came to be for us. Something I'd like to share here, it says, okay, in the cartoon, there is a small change. Red bag has the sandwiches, green bag is your parachute. And looking at what's here for the visual, many of us have heard quite a bit about IQ. EQ, maybe quite a bit of information, not so much as IQ, and then almost nothing when it comes to AQ, or it's starting to trickle in for you. As we mentioned, it is the adaptability or adversity quotient. I do want to repeat that so you really have that etched in your brain. It's the ability to face and overcome changes and adversities. However, we can find ourselves in situations where the resilience must be an immediate course of action along with an innovative approach. And as we can see in this picture, thinking on your feet is out of the question. But I'm sure you all have experienced those individuals that you believe really had a tenacity, you know, that skill set, that aptitude for quickly thinking on their feet. Let's look at the differences, some of the differences we can focus on with the Qs. So the ability to learn, the IQ. It identifies your potential or aptitude for learning. A high IQ individual is considered to be one that's beyond 120, but it is not linked to greater leadership effectiveness. So there is no link to that. And that's based on research. EQ, measure of one's ability for social interaction, pertains to the individual in relation to others. Increasing EQ is linked to greater leadership effectiveness. For AQ, pertains to the individual and changes going on around him or her. AQ is a part of EQ. And increasing AQ is linked to greater leadership effectiveness. What I'd like you to do is, looking at these cues, Mary, are we able to activate the annotation tool? Or is that something I have the ability to do?
I don't think we have that activated. I apologize.
Okay, not a problem. Data on the cues. A study by DDI revealed that IQ represents 99% of business savviness, which is basically being business focused, while EQ represents the remaining 1%. DDI describes business savviness as being able to quickly and accurately size up merits and risks in complex business scenarios. So someone who is really conscious and really skilled in the business acumen. That's where that IQ comes in very strongly, whereas the EQ, the 1%. Well, looking at another piece of data here, IQ represents 1% of cultivating networks, while EQ represents 99% of cultivating networks. And what we're talking about here is cultivating networks essentially involves knowing with whom you need to network, how to leverage your existing network contacts, and how to create and maintain internal and external relationships. And whether or not you believe it, research as well as what companies and organizations have experienced reflect the fact that regardless of how much a leader or manager knows, it is essentially about being able to navigate the relationships, navigate and move through the lines of the hierarchy, working through your relationships to be able to get the job done. And that is essentially going to revolve around that EQ state for the individual. Your IQ, what you are, how you rank in terms of your IQ, your aptitude, your ability to learn, that's with you from a certain age on through the rest of your life with not much change going on, regardless of how much you learn. Once your IQ has been identified at a certain level, that's what sticks with you with very little change going on. Your EQ, that's a different story. That is something that you do have the ability to impact. And that's part of the focus with this session, to see just how that can be done. More data here. According to Daniel Goleman, he's our go-to when it comes to EQ. EQ represents 67% of the abilities necessary for superior performance. Organizations are really seeing a competitive advantage with soft skills, especially as technology continues to advance. We all know right now in the state of things, there is a greater than ever before dependence on virtual interactions, the use of technology being the forerunner in how we go about doing business. And then as also the automation becomes more and more prevalent in dominating the hard skills, this is something where we're seeing that as the landscape with technology continues to do this overhaul, there's more emphasis on the need for the soft skills within an individual to be brought up to a greater level to offset this. FedEx, Google, Facebook, L'Oreal, PepsiCo, Zappos, those are just a few examples of organizations investing in emotional intelligence training based on research showing that EQ is an even greater predictor of effective leadership. That's another reason we consider EQ to be more important to leadership than IQ. So what does that mean for AQ? A study by a researcher named John Antonakis at the University of Lausanne found that AQ represents a skill that 61% of CEOs say is difficult to find. I believe it is fair to say that we will have much more data that speaks to the adaptability quotient following our current circumstances that we're experiencing. And finally, with AQ, 75% of industry leaders do not feel they can equip internal talent with skills needed for the future. And with this research, I am sure we will see more data that speaks to the need for AQ, rising beyond the need for EQ, especially given our current pandemic. There is not much you can do to impact your IQ, as I mentioned previously. However, you can take steps to develop your EQ and AQ in turn, which can positively impact your leadership. Any comments or questions?
Esther, this is Mary. So that last slide was really talking about 75% of leaders feel they can't equip internal talent with the adaptability skill. Is that focused on the AQ?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So if we go back and revisit what the meaning is, AQ, that adversity quotient, the adaptability quotient, it's essentially, I want to make sure we're clear about how to distinguish it from change management. Change management, we are talking about change you initiate, change you see the need to make, and managing how that change happens, how folks are responding, how you go about navigating the communication process and all of that to make it render your results as intended. AQ is in another sense, it's in another domain. These are changes that have been thrust upon you, changes that are out of your control and were not anticipated. How do you respond to that? How do you overcome? How do you still continue to be resilient and thrive? That's AQ. And that's where we have these industry leaders talking about they don't feel they have the skills to equip internal talent with AQ.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for that question. And this was just a quote that I thought really hit at the heart of How We Understand Change. And it's from John Cotter, who is also an expert that we look to in the area of change management. The EQ breakdown. Typically, I would go through these and have us recognize what each emotion appears to be for what we see here in the visuals. I'm just going to ask if you can just fill in the chat one emotion that you see in any of the pictures. Any emotion that you see that's represented here. And we'll just take a few seconds to call some of those out. Anything coming in the chat for us, Mary?
Yep, lots of it. So we have, let me scroll up to the top here, work my way down. Sad, anger, frustration, a couple of those. Surprise, a couple of those. Happy,
Okay.
happiness. Revulsion.
Okay.
Anger, worried is a new one.
All right. I believe you all have identified almost all of these. So I'll go ahead and reveal them. Think, discuss was the only one that I didn't hear, but I heard a very close synonym that Mary called out. So nice job with that. Why did we go through that? Well, one thing we need to understand, our emotional intelligence, or EQ, is essentially based on 6 emotions. You may sometimes hear 5, or you may hear the hundreds of emotions that we have are based on or stem from an essential 6 or an essential 5. These are the 5 that I chose to go with for the basis. But you're always going to hear that most research shows that there are just essentially 5 to 7 major emotions, that all of our other emotions from which they are derived. And so many individuals, such as psychologist Paul Ekman, I believe his name is, in 1972, he suggested these 6. So these are the ones I wanted to share. And what I would like to drive home is the fact that emotions are not necessarily good or bad. It's our response to them, or what we do as a result of our emotions. And that's similar to that fence story I talked about earlier. And I like how Dr. Travis Bradberry breaks it down. If you are familiar with Emotional Intelligence 2.0, that is an awesome book that gives you a basic understanding of what emotional intelligence is and why it's so important to how you go about doing business, how you approach leadership, how you approach workplace interactions. And he also touches on things on a personal note. But one thing he says is the goal is to make sure you are not allowing your emotions to hijack your ability to reason. Of course, we want to be conscious of emotions. Of course, we want to recognize our own. The goal, though, is not allowing them to take over, where you are emotionally unstable or you think with your emotions and then act upon them as opposed to acting rationally or logically. So high EQ individuals. So some high EQ folks we'd like to talk about. We'll start with the high EQ folks. A high EQ person has the ability to demonstrate balance between emotion and reason. They are also mindful of their own feelings, as well as what may trigger certain emotional states for them. As you all mentioned in your descriptions, you talked about individuals that you recognize as the best bosses who had empathy, who showed compassion for others, and they were able to demonstrate signs of high self-esteem. A couple of individuals here as examples for high AQ. High AQ folks, they demonstrated the ability to respond to the need to adjust course in the midst of unanticipated changes, as I mentioned before. And then just jumping down to the lower bullet point, adaptability shortens the time span leaders need to react to changes, to be the right thing, the right product, the right service at the right time. And that's something we're seeing right now in our daily lives, especially when it comes to business. I'd like to take this into two models that we can apply that relate to EQ and AQ. First one for EQ. This is Goldman's model. This slide and the next slide are probably my two favorite slides in the presentation because they hit at the heart of what EQ and AQ are about. So we have 4 quadrants here. This first quadrant in Goldman's EQ model is regarding self-awareness. So with the self-awareness is essentially, I know what I can recognize what emotional state I'm in. I'm also confident in myself. And then I am also able to recognize what causes my mood swings, what triggers me, what are my buttons, and when a button has been pressed, when I have allowed someone to trigger me to go into another emotional state. I can gauge that accurately about myself. The social awareness, that particular quadrant deals with, do you have empathy for another person? Not to be confused with sympathy. So sympathy is simply, I feel for you, whereas empathy is something different. Is there someone who can share a description that you think is done very well to describe the difference between sympathy and empathy? Anyone want to take a stab at that for us?
Okay, I'll take a stab. So sympathy is, like you said, I feel sorry for your situation. Empathy is, let me walk in your shoes and feel that, feel what you're feeling.
Thank you. And that was that Todd?
That was.
Okay, thank you, Todd. And that really hits at the heart of it. There is an awesome short video clip that Brene Brown has that talks about and actually shows the difference between sympathy and empathy. And it gives wonderful visualizations for exactly what Todd described. The next one, relationship management, is getting into, not only am I empathetic to others, but I'm able to use my own skills and influence, my own ability to navigate the change landscape to strengthen relationships. I have great people skills. I'm able to pick up on the moods and things of others, but I apply that to how I interact with them. Okay, so there is a distinct difference between the social awareness quadrant and the relationship management quadrant. So the social awareness, I'm picking up the moods of others. I'm able to recognize what I may do that changes someone else's mood. I'm able to recognize what I can do, with someone else. Whereas the relationship management is more so getting into what you are able to do in terms of building upon strengthening your relationships with other people inside and outside your team, and that feedback. You're really good with the feedback. And then we have the final one, self-management, that quadrant. It's distinguished from self-awareness. Self-awareness, I know myself. I know what ticks me off. I know what takes me there. Whereas self-management, I know how to keep myself from going there. I can control it. I don't become emotionally unstable. I don't allow my button to be pressed, or if, it temporarily gets pressed, I'm able to quickly bring myself back. Okay. And that's where we have adaptability. And that's where we can say that AQ is a part of EQ, because that deals with that self-management. How I initially responded and then ongoing in a state, how I have been responding to the state of things I'm experiencing now, how I've been able to handle, myself and present myself in terms of the image to others. So if we had the annotation tool, I would have you all check off which quadrant you think is a strong suit for you. But since we don't, if you could just mention in the chat which one you think is a strong suit for you, which quadrant. If it's the self-awareness, you can say the SA. If it's the self-management, you could say SM. Relationship management, RM. Social awareness, SA. SAW for social awareness. So if you could do that. Which one is a strong suit for you? And it doesn't have to just be one. I'm just thinking right off the top, without any hesitation, this is definitely one that's a strong area for you. For me, I would probably go with the self-management quadrant.
Esther, we see so far SA and RM.
Oh, okay, awesome.
Waiting for a few more to chime in.
All right. And while we have others who are still in the process of adding your responses, one thing I'd like to emphasize is being strong in just one of these quadrants does not speak to a person who is a high EQ individual. The goal is to have strong points going with all of the quadrants. So for example, if you say someone has really good people skills because you feel like either the social awareness or the relationship management quadrant is a strong suit for them, that does not equate to that is a high EQ individual, because you still have 2 other or 3 other quadrants that need to be satisfied. So we need all of these going on. I can be an individual who has a lot of self-control, but I can really have poor, and excuse my phrasing of it, but I can really suck when it comes to how I engage with people or interact. So that would not make me a high EQ individual. So we want to look at all of these as pieces to the puzzle to make us high EQ individuals. Any other comments or thoughts on that? Okay, for AQ, let's get into what Paul Stoltz shared with us. In his book, Adversity Quotient at Work, Paul Stoltz shared this as one example of a model for AQ. And what I thought was really great about this model is it speaks to what he considers to be 4 dimensions that are key to how we are able to face adversity. And again, what's adversity, or what are we talking about when we say AQ? We're talking about those changes that you didn't anticipate, that just caught you off guard, that came out the blue. Yes, you can have backup plans. You can be one who is ready when things don't go according to plan. That does not mean you always have yourself in a position where you can anticipate what's going to happen, okay? So some things that tie into his model, one dimension is control. That's the extent to which you can positively influence the situation. So how do you perceive yourself as having that ability to still respond to the situation because you recognize what you can and cannot control? That's that dimension. Ownership. That is the extent to which you take the initiative to make improvements. Or are you one who feels like you're powerless? Everything is just happening to you. You have no control because you don't have a certain position, or you have no control because your plan just fell apart. And so now you feel like you can do nothing. Okay, so that's one who does not see themselves as being in position to take ownership. Okay, or do you see yourself as, regardless of what happens, let me focus on what I do have the ability to do, and I'm able to say, well, you know what, this didn't work, but at least I can do this. Or at least if I give this a try, I can still make some improvement or enhancement to what's going on to positively impact the state of things. The reach dimension. That's the extent to which you allow the adversity to impact other areas of your work and life. And then with the reach dimension, that's also getting into how well are you able to respond to that particular situation that you're facing that was out of your control? Are you able to limit its reach where it's not something that's keeping you awake at night? It's not something that's negatively impacting how you interact with your family or friends because it's constantly a burden. It's constantly, pulling you down and impeding upon maybe your performance or your relationships. That's the reach. And then finally, endurance. How long you perceive that adversity will last. Are you able to see long term that I'm coming out of this? This is not going to last forever. I can't see when it's going to end, but I know it's temporary. That's the endurance. Any dimension seem like one you can honestly say, even without an assessment, I feel that's a strong one for me. The control, the ownership, the reach, the endurance, and you can simply type in a letter. Which one would you say is currently a strong one for you? Any responses coming in for us, Mary?
Yes, we have a little bit of everything right now. Control, ownership, endurance, another control.
Wonderful. Okay. That control is a really good one. And it's really impressive when you can recognize where you may be strong, because although there are assessments you can complete that help you to determine more specifically what your AQ may be, what your EQ may be, we know that there are things that can impede or create barriers for us to enhance our cues for certain things, whether it be our awareness and seeking out maybe resources to assist us with being more aware of ourselves, more aware of how we interact with others, and maybe considering getting feedback from other people. You know yourself to a certain point, but what additional steps can you take to learn more about yourself so that you are not deceiving yourself, like the Leader Self-Deception from the Arbinger Institute, a really good book there. Okay, what other things do you see as ways that maybe you can think about barriers and address those barriers when you are looking to improve your cues? Can anyone share something in the chat when it comes to resources, cost, or even accountability? Steps you can take to enhance the cues to address barriers. Anything coming in the chat, Mary?
Not yet.
Okay.
I think honestly, this session is one of those things. That reminder and awareness of the EQ and the AQ. Personally, I was resonating with the AQ given all the things that we're needing to adapt to and needing to help leaders adapt to.
Thank you. That's so true. And an action plan, I typically say, is something that's really crucial. What steps can you take and commit to putting into action to hold yourself accountable where you're able to recognize all these things? And some of the items that can assist you with that include, of course, the assessments that will be in a resource list that you can capture from the presentation, but even looking at yourself to see that there is a need for change, as well as where, developing that action plan, and then holding yourself accountable by the way you go about approaching execution. So these are resources included here, along with information from some of the books that I mentioned. So I hope these are things that you all can really take value within and use them as takeaways for the cues. And so this is my contact information. And hopefully I've shared something with you that can assist you with steps that you take to be hole fillers rather than nail drivers. And that is actually all for me, Mary.
Thank you so much. I do want to just give us, maybe a couple seconds for people to chat in some of the key takeaways. Maybe jot down Esther's email if you want to connect to learn more. We are recording this and we'll make this available to you all who registered for the session if you want to go back and revisit some of what we've talked about today. But any key takeaways? Who wants to just come off mute and share? Learning more about AQ and how to apply it. AQ is a new term. Um, you know,
Hi.
go ahead.
Hi, this is
Hi.
Maria.
Hey.
Hi. So AQ is a new term. I've been looking at all sorts of Qs, and into what creates a positive and optimal culture.
Okay.
And I guess I'm gonna dig into that one. For now, though, what I was looking at was emotional, cultural intelligence, social intelligence, which is, piggybacks off of emotional. So AQ is a different element. And so, well, thank you for this presentation and bringing it to our attention, because it's something to add to hopefully a curriculum I'm building.
Awesome. And you're very welcome. Happy to hear that.
Thank you for coming off mute. And thank you so much, Esther, for your time and your work in bringing this presentation and this content to us. We will be sending out a very short survey. Hopefully it'll come out to you later today, just for some feedback and for your insights on additional things that you want to continue to learn more about from our Central Ohio chapter. Encourage that you get on our website, log in, and look for all of the events, which are virtual right now till future notice, and look and see what we have coming up. Esther, just thank you so much. This was very timely and very insightful.
Well, thank you all for the opportunity. Appreciate everyone who was able to join us. Thanks,
Yes, thank you, Esther.
Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
You're welcome.